Okay, guys, welcome back. Just getting the stream started and doing so 10 minutes early as usual. So there's still 10 minutes until we get the lecture comments underway. We're good to be with you and hope you're having a great time. Good day today. Yeah, so no rush, but hang in there. 10 minutes into the recorded video or live video, whatever you're watching, we'll be starting. Okay, thank you guys. Oh, hey there, Jen and Jennifer. Good to see you guys. Glad you're here. We still have, a little bit of time, but nice to be early with it. About 8 minutes or so until we really get rolling. Hey, Leanne, welcome back. Just for a second, I'm going to grab a little sparkling water. Hey, Jasmine, good to see you. Hello. Santino, welcome back. Hey. Rosemary, nice. Good to see you. Still about 5 minutes till we get going. Juliet, Anthony, hey there. Good to be with you guys. Good to see you. Thank you. A little under 5 minutes until we can get the lecture started. So I hope you guys just have a nice, comfortable viewing setup. Hey, Tyler. Hello, Nick. Hey there. Okay, 3 minutes to go till we start. Elena, hello. Poria, hello. Michelle, welcome back. Hello. Just another 90 seconds, pretty much, and then we can start. Okay, one more minute. Hi, Jasmine. Okay, no worries. Good to see you then, Mary Jane. Cayenne, hello. Okay, guys, so it's 4 p.m. First off, again, thanks as usual for your attendance and following the course and all your preparation and study. I appreciate you guys. We're back again, and today it's Thursday, April the 10th. We're continuing on our new topic that we started since after the spring break, which is all about animal ethics and the question of whether we have any moral obligations to change, reform, or in any way reconsider our practices concerning animals. So I'll start off by just kind of summarizing the stuff that we did talk about on Tuesday, and then we'll kind of transition into the remaining parts of Singer's article that we didn't finish yet. So I started off by just kind of mentioning to you all in general how there are some moral questions that rise concerning both animals and the environment in modern times, because in previous generations of human history, it might have seemed to human beings that there was no possible way we could ever cause enough impact on the environment, ecosystem, planet to damage it or to threaten our position on it. But now we know that's not necessarily true. The planet has all kinds of threats and dangers that are in some ways, in some certain cases at least, man-made. Global warming, climate change, deforestation, overpopulation, extinction of various species. So we ask questions like, how could we address some of these problems? What kind of value should we bring to approach our solutions? And do we have moral obligations, basically, to either the environment or non-human animals? Do we have duties to animals? Is it morally permitted for us to use them any way we would like to advance human purposes and interests? Or do we owe them like respect? Do they have rights, for example? Do non-sentient aspects of nature have rights, like forests, trees, waterways, wetlands? These debates, in part, have to do with moral status. And I think what we were talking about last time, how moral status is if something has it, then it's entitled to some degree of consideration and respect. A being with moral status can't just be destroyed with no consideration at all of its interests or its perspective or its well-being. Now, we obviously, as humans, regard each other as having moral status, and maybe our pets, but the traditional view of the West and many other cultures, honestly, has been the assumption that animals don't have any significant or serious moral status, that they are just tools that we can use for our own purposes as we see fit. Let me just quickly go ahead and, if I may pause my commentary, I just want to again, I see numbers fluctuate with regard to the attendance. It's like sometimes there will be a healthy number, then it will start to dip as I get into my comments. And then it's like sometimes I notice that until I prompt the class with like a notification on Canvas, some people are just not arriving. So a little disappointing because we're 11 weeks into the semester. There's no ambiguity or, lack of clarity about what the schedule is and when we're supposed to be here for the synchronous class. But whatever, I'm just going to do another quick post. So give me 2 seconds to do that in my other window here. All right, cool. So there, the post just went up, and Sandra, good to see you there as well. I think I said hi to Julian. Again, it's important to maintain your good attendance in the class. It's an online class, but it's not an asynchronous format. So you do have to be here. I mean, I keep repeating myself. But look, the thing is, someone will get punished if they are not attending class without an excused absence. I'm not receiving emails from anybody saying, hey, here's why I can't be there. So you're expected to attend the class. And, that's just clear and that's required. So, don't set yourself up for disappointment if you receive some kind of docked credit because you're not reliably attending. But if you're here, then you don't have to worry about nothing. And if you're not here, you have to have an excuse for not being here. You can't just fail to attend without notifying me as to why. All right, anyway, as I was saying, traditionally the view of the West is that animals don't have any kind of moral status. Why? Well, there's different viewpoints as to why. We talked about some of them. Do they lack a soul? Do they lack the ability to enter into contracts? Do they lack the sort of rich and long-standing type of relationships that characterize human relations? To all these points, there could be a counter-argument given. For example, whether even humans have a soul is speculative, or whether animals don't, I guess, is equally speculative. And then to the issue of, not having the ability to enter into contracts or having language, tool use, rationality, contract, entering into contracts, all those same things could also be found, at least in some category of human beings, like perhaps those with severe mental disabilities or deficiencies. And we don't say of them that they lack rights or that they can be used for any kind of purpose that we deem fit, since they're outside the moral community. Anyway, then we turn to Peter Singer, and he's still the author for today. So Peter Singer and his essay, All Animals Are Equal. Yeah, so Peter Singer, his view is that what gives a being moral status? Someone may remember this, because Peter Singer doesn't think it's just us with moral status. He believes it has to extend over to the animals. But what is it about animals that we have in common with them that he thinks qualifies them to receive moral consideration and respect? It's not whether you can talk. It's not whether you can read a contract and then agree to it. It's something more perhaps basic. Hey there, Giannis and Mary Jane. If they can suffer, correct. It's just whether or not the being is capable of suffering. So that is where he thinks we need to make room for animals in the moral community because they can suffer, they can feel pain, they can experience deprivation, suffering. So he thinks that when animals suffer, we should consider their suffering on par with human suffering. This is all driven in part by a major principle of his, which is known as the equal consideration of interest principle, or the equal consideration principle. What it says is that we should give equal weight to the like interests of all those affected by our actions. So, equal consideration principle, putting it back in the chat again. Not to worry. Good to see you there, Justin. Hey, Karen. Okay, equal consideration principle. We should give equal weight to the like interests of all those affected by our actions. So if interests are the same kind of interest, that's what like interests refers to, then we should show the same degree of consideration and respect for those interests, regardless of who may have them. The equal consideration principle is needed to upstand all the notions of human equality that we've advanced in the, say, past several hundred years, whether that's more equal treatment of women, members of different racial categories, people with various disabilities or different age groups. We don't think that because, say, you're a woman or a person with a certain color of skin, that you are less worthy of respect for your interests as others that have the same interests. So, for example, I think I mentioned the point that if you arrived at a doctor's office with some need for medical care because you were in a certain type of pain, and there was another human being with the same sort of pain as you, it would be considered a form of bigotry or discrimination for the other to be prioritized over you on an arbitrary basis, like the color of skin or the gender category they're in. To say that the pain of a man matters more and we're going to pay more attention to it than the pain of a woman, or the pain of a white person matters more than the pain of a black person. These would either be sexist or racist ideas, and we certainly think that those things are wrong when it's applied to humans. We don't think that unequal treatment of the same interests is merited or morally appropriate with regard to other human beings. But the author Singer thinks that we can't limit our equal consideration principle to just humans because, at least with regard to the interest in avoiding pain, animals and humans have that in common. Now, some interests that humans have uniquely apply to humans, and there's no animal that has an interest in the same thing because they're incapable of it. So if we're talking about an interest in marrying the partner of your choice, or voting in an election, or having a primary education, these are interests that can't necessarily apply to animals because the animal doesn't understand or comprehend the things that the interest relates to. That kind of almost calls our mind back to the earlier lectures on Michael Tooley, who said that in order to have a right to something, you have to at least be capable of having an interest in it. So Singer's not going to argue that animals should be given the right to vote or to marry or to practice religion, because obviously they don't have interest in those things. But one thing that they definitely have an interest in, which we have as well, and which is the same, is an interest in avoiding, painful stimuli and suffering. And so he thinks that if we respect the human interest in avoiding pain and suffering, we need to do the same when it comes to animals. And if we don't, we will then engage in speciesism, which is unequal treatment of like interests only on the basis that the other being is of a different species than you. And if we replace the word species there with either gender or race, then we would have a definition of either racism or sexism. Unequal treatment of like interest just because the being is of a different gender or race than you would be a form of bigotry within the human community. Hey there, Natalie. Good to see you too. But he thinks that the same kind of discriminatory form of mistreatment of others can be seen with our treatment of animals insofar as we don't grant equal consideration to their interest in avoiding pain. So the relevant moral question not is about animals is not whether they can read, talk, enter into contracts or any of those things. It's just can they suffer? And since they can suffer and they're interested in avoiding it, just like you and me, we should show equal respect to that interest as we do in humans. Okay, so we got, I think, to the point in the lecture where we were going to start talking about what forms of speciesism there are in our everyday lives. What ways, for example, do we seem to at least occasionally indulge in speciesism according to the author's definition of it anyway? So here he gives us a series of claims. The section of the article I'm talking about is where he mentions what he calls speciesism in practice. So the question or the commentary anyway is, how are we in some cases speciesist in our everyday human practices? So how do we act in ways that are speciesist in our everyday lives? That's what he means by the heading speciesism in practice. In our everyday practices, how do we do things that could be considered speciesist? So the perhaps most obvious example of that is using animals as food. Hey, Carson, good to see you there. So one, using animals as food. Now, many of us have pets, and we have our various interactions with animals, but the author makes the point that for a lot of us anyway, our primary contact with animals comes at mealtime. And if you think about eating animals, pigs, cows, chickens, just to name a few, that's a very basic form of animal exploitation in a sense, because if their interests require equal respect to the human interest in the same things, then we could not justify a carnivorous diet. He makes a point here. So I'm going to write it in the chat. So give me a second. So it says the equal consideration principle does not permit sacrificing major important interests for the sake of trivial interests. So when we eat animals, when we're eating burgers, chicken, bacon, all those different things, we are putting the interests of the animal to live pain-free and free of suffering. And we're sacrificing that for the sake of what human interests? Like, what are we getting for the sake of all the pain and misery that these animals are exposed to on factory farms? Well, what we get is the pleasure of the palate, the taste of the meat. It's not necessary for longevity or health or survival. So you can't say, well, it's sad that we do this, but there's no other way literally to survive. That's obviously contradicted by the evident existence of vegetarians, vegans, and many other people that either altogether forego or limit their consumption of meat without any exhibited signs of like decreased health or wellness. In fact, a person can live an entirely healthy life, and some people argue even healthier, lower cholesterol, better heart health, and so forth, by having a vegetarian diet. So when we eat the animals, we're balancing a minor human interest, the pleasure of taste, against the fundamental well-being and life of the welfare of the animals. The equal consideration principle would forbid sacrificing major to minor interests. And to sort of drive home his point, not to worry, hi there, Natalia, I'll make it clearer in the chat. Hey, Daniel, good to see you too. consumption of meat is not necessary. It's not required for a person to be healthy, long-lived, or to survive in the first place. So So, eating meat sacrifices the animal's like interest in avoiding pain and suffering for the minor interest of the pleasure of the palate. So, what we would have to give up by not eating meat is not our health, not our longevity, not our ability to survive, but just foregoing the, I guess, somewhat pleasurable taste that some people find in the flavor or texture or, um, gustatory phenomenon of eating the meat. And it's an equal consideration principle says we have to give like weight to like interests. So you couldn't justify the consumption of human flesh just by saying, oh, well, it's delicious, especially if not only did it kill the human being, but caused them to live their entire life in captivity and suffer a great deal of pain. It's not just the death of the animal either, because to get us the meat at cheap market prices, the animals have to suffer in terrible conditions. The first priority in animal agriculture that generates meat for us as consumers, hey Miana, is efficiency and maximum yield. So the animal's well-being is not even factored in to what matters in terms of getting the maximum amount of animal products out to the consumer. So that, of course, necessitates that we place them in, industrial type settings where we streamline the production of them as animal products for human use. I'll read a couple things in the book that touch on this. It says here, on page 582, he says, the case against using animals for food is at its strongest when animals are made to lead miserable lives so that their flesh can be made available to humans at the lowest possible cost. Modern forms of intensive farming apply science and technology to the attitude that animals are objects for us to use. In order to have meat on the table at a price that people can afford, our society tolerates methods of meat production that confine sentient animals in cramped, unsuitable conditions for the whole duration of their lives. Animals are treated like machines that convert fodder into flesh, and any innovation that results in a higher conversion ratio is liable to be adopted. As one authority on the topic has said, quote, cruelty is acknowledged only when profitability ceases, end quote. To avoid speciesism, we must stop these practices. Our custom is all the support that factory farmers need. The decision to cease giving them that support may be difficult, but it's less difficult than it would have been for a white Southerner to go against the traditions of his society and free his slaves. These arguments apply to animals who have been reared in factory farms, which means that we should not eat, this is Singer speaking, I'm just reading his quote, that we should not eat chicken, pork, or veal unless we know that the meat we are eating was not produced by factory farm methods. The same is true of beef that has come from cattle kept in crowded feedlots, as most beef in the United States does, eggs coming from hens kept in small wire cages, too small to allow them to stretch their wings. So that's why he thinks that the consumption of meat, a common practice that many and most all of us probably do indulge in, is something morally problematic. Now, notice, though, that his argument doesn't necessarily imply pure vegetarianism, because he says that you only have to treat the same interests with the same consideration. And the interest in not having your life end or continuing to exist, this will now recall our earlier abortion lectures. You could argue that the animal, due to its lack of cognitive power, doesn't have a full comprehension of the subtleties of death. It might not understand, for example, that it's destined to, at some point in the future, cease to exist, and thus it might not be contemplating with the same kind of existential angst that humans are, its desire to forestall its death as long as possible or to reach the end of its natural lifespan. Am I making sense to you guys? So, like, just because animals have the ability to suffer doesn't necessarily mean that they have the abstract awareness of themselves no longer existing at some point. So Singer's argument is sophisticated enough to grant that it's not actually a moral imperative for us to be vegetarians. All he's saying is that we are not morally permitted to cause animals pain and suffering that we wouldn't be willing to do to a human in the same case. So for Singer, it actually could be considered permissible to eat animal flesh, meat, but only if these animals were not generated through practices that expose them to massive pain and suffering. Now, the factory farm system in animal agriculture generally does involve a lot of suffering for the animals, but there are, you may know, like certain animal products, meat, and etc., that you can pay a higher premium for, like a higher price, that are produced in more humane settings. So, do you understand this point? Singer is saying that even if maybe vegetarianism is not morally obligatory, desisting from the consumption of animal products that were produced through a lot of pain and suffering are. So you could actually satisfy the implications of Singer's moral argument if you ate meat, as long as this meat was made in cruelty-free or more humane methods, both of animal rearing and slaughter. So like if you go to like a boutique grocery store, Whole Foods, Lazy Acres, Sprouts, and you're willing to pay top dollar for meat that was grown on farms that are smaller in size, where the animals can range free, or free-range eggs, where the chickens that produce them are not forced into confined spaces and feedlots, then that would actually bypass the criticism that Singer's making of the status quo. Because again, it's only the requirement to take care of the like interests, or to respect with equal measure the like interests of the animals. So since we can suffer and they can, and we both are interested in avoiding that, that's what we have to give equal respect for. But there may not be any equivalent interest on the side of the animal on not having its life ended prematurely. So yes, Santino, kind of like the practice of halal or kosher in either Islamic or Jewish customary dietary restrictions, but not merely halal or kosher, because those also involve some kind of religious practice, like a blessing or what have you, by either a rabbi or imam or some other religious figure. But yeah, like just more broadly speaking, like anybody who's, whether they're of those religions or not, would have some obligation, he thinks, to make sure that they are gaining access to meat from humane sources. I'll read you his words on that so you can hear him put it in his own way. He says on page 582, these arguments do not take us all the way to a vegetarian diet, because some animals still graze freely. But the American pattern of fattening cattle in crowded feedlots is starting to spread to other countries. Meanwhile, the lives of free-ranging animals are undoubtedly better than those of animals raised in factory farms. It's still doubtful if using them for food is compatible with equal consideration of their interests. One problem, of course, is that using them as food involves killing them. This is an issue to which, as I've said, we will return when we've discussed the value of life. Apart from taking their lives, there are also many other things done to animals in order to bring them cheaply to our dinner table. Castration, separation of mother and young, breaking up of herds, branding, transporting, slaughter. All of these are likely to involve suffering and do not take the animal's interests into account. Perhaps animals could be reared on a small scale without suffering in these ways. But it does not seem economical or practical to do so on the scale required for feeding our large urban populations. In any case, the important question is not whether animal flesh could be produced without suffering, but whether the flesh we are considering buying was produced without suffering. Unless we can be confident that it was, the principle of equal consideration of interests implies that it was wrong to sacrifice important interests of the animal in order to satisfy less important interests of our own. Therefore, we should boycott the end result of this process. It would require a high standard of animal treatment to fall in line with the criticisms stated by this author. Because if, for example, you were just going to like McDonald's or Burger King or Carl's Jr. and getting a burger, this is not like the kind of boutique high premium price beef that would bypass the criticism that you're taking meat from a source where the animal involved suffered a lot, and both in the process of rearing it and slaughtering it. So it would require major reforms to our everyday consumer and dietary practices. So that's why he thinks that the use of animals, notably with a few exceptions I mentioned, would be generally a case of speciesism, something that violates the equal consideration of interest principle, and would therefore be wrong on those grounds, according to him. Another case of speciesism in practice. So speciesism in practice number 2. So the second way that he thinks that a lot of us either participate indirectly in the practice of speciesism, or the pattern of speciesism, or at least condone it, is the use of animals in experiments. So experimenting on animals. Animal experiments. So there are a lot of industries that generate products that are at least partially resulting from the use of animals in biomedical experiments. Um, some people say that this is justified because it serves vital medical purposes. For example, if we use animal specimens to try and test out therapeutic treatments that will eventually be used on humans for cures of various diseases, you might say, well, the alleviation of the pain and suffering in the human world that the exposure to these harsh experiments to the animal creates is worth the suffering and pain the animal suffers. Because in this case, you might say it's not for a trivial or non-essential reason. If it results in like the delivery of cures, treatments, therapeutic interventions, then isn't that valuable enough to somehow offset whatever pain and suffering the animals suffer in the process? But he thinks that this is wrong. Singer's view is that the value that we get for continuing animal experiments today, it pales in comparison to the suffering that those same animals experience. So what are some examples of like medical and other experiments conducted on animals that he thinks just involve a bad ratio of pain to the animal versus minor or insignificant benefits to mankind? So example one that he mentions is the Dray's test. So what's the Dray's test? It's a bit disturbing, but there's a real test out there in certain industries. Like, for example, suppose that you're a company, Unilever or Procter and Gamble, whatever, and you produce things like shampoos or body wash or other things that humans will, of course, use eventually and apply to their skin or body. You notice how sometimes you'll see on those packages a little label that says, be careful, do not expose to the eye, or if you do, flush with water. If you've exposed it excessively, you may have to seek the poison control center or go to the emergency room and call a doctor. How is it that they know how to label these products, and how also do they know that the product won't outright induce blindness or permanently damage your tissues with respect to your eye and etc.? Well, the Dray's test is one test that's used to try and give the company information about the dangers that this product could have if it was directly exposed to the eye. So what they'll do is they'll get either like little rabbits, monkeys, other typically mammals, and they will directly apply a solution of the tested material or solvent into the eye, seeing to what degree will this happen. And these are live specimens that are not anesthetized, right? And we're trying to expose them in sufficient number and quantity until we induce blindness or other permanent damage in the eye. That gives us some idea of the parameters or the limitations of what exceeds an acceptable amount of damage. And also it might result sometimes in changing the formula if it was shown that it was causing more permanent damage from lower exposure levels. So imagine that we take these helpless, defenseless little animals and we force apply, toxic substances straight to the eye so that we can determine in what way and in what quantity would this cause sufficient damage to be something that can't be marketable to humans. This is done with shampoo, food additives, colorings, preservatives. But the author says, now you might be thinking, well, of course that sucks for the animal, but we need to do it because how else could we possibly learn what effect it would have on human eyes? We can't test these on human subjects, God forbid. So the best option that exists to get a live specimen with a similar type of physiological structure is to do it on an animal. But Singer makes the interesting point that these are being done today on products where we already have a whole bunch of alternative products in that same product line. So These tests have already been conducted in the past on existing products. So why would they be done today? Because they're trying to introduce some new spin-off of the same product into the consumer marketplace. But we already have enough options when it comes to, shampoos, additives, colorings, and preservatives. So what he's saying is, if you're supportive of these experiments, it can't be because they're vitally necessary to protect human well-being. You might have been able to make an argument somewhat to that effect when these products didn't exist and they were just being introduced to the market in the first place. But when Unilever, Procter & Gamble, or whatever is creating like a 10th new variety of shampoo with a slightly different formula today, just so that they can relabel it and create another product for the consumer to choose from, you might wonder, well, didn't we already have enough of those products to begin with? Couldn't we have simply continued the sale and marketing of the existing product line so that no new experiments are actually required? There's also brutal military experiments too. It also supports consumerism, which is also frowned upon. Yeah, perhaps. I mean, it's not necessarily bad to be a consumer in the marketplace that makes use of these products, but all he's trying to say is continuing experiments of this type are not like strictly necessary for us to have any such products, because once we've already tested them in the past, we should be able to discontinue future experiments. But they continue to go on the simple basis, on the only sole basis that people in these companies want to introduce for the consumers, alternative products that are similar, but with a new formula. There's also brutal military experiments that are sometimes conducted on animals to give us information about wartime conditions that human soldiers could be subjected to, so that we have some kind of estimation of how that would affect a human. Can you believe this? So he talks about one that's very brutal. I'm going to try to read about it here. I'll read you some of his quotations as we're talking about this. So he says, experimenting on animals. Perhaps the area in which speciesism can most clearly be observed is the use of animals in experiments. Here the issue stands out because experimenters often seek to justify experimenting on animals by claiming that the experiments lead us to discoveries about humans. If this is true, the experimenter must agree that human and non-human animals are similar in crucial respects. For instance, if forcing a rat to choose between starving to death and crossing an electrical grid to obtain food tells us anything about the reactions of humans to stress, we must assume that the rat feels stress in this kind of situation. People sometimes think that all animal experiments serve vital medical purposes and can be justified on the grounds that they relieve more suffering than they cause. This comfortable belief is mistaken. Drug companies test new shampoos and cosmetics they are intending to market by dripping concentrated solutions of them into the eyes of rabbits, a test known as the Drey's test. Food additives, including artificial colorings and preservatives, are tested by what is known as the LD50. I guess I didn't mention the LD50. Let me go into that because that's another very brutal one. So, as he says in the text, sometimes what we're testing are not shampoos and so on, but food additives, artificial colorings, and preservatives. And we need to know that those things, like how toxic they are. So what they'll do is LD stands for lethal dose, and LD50 is an abbreviation for lethal dose 50%. So what you'll do is you'll take a sample set of animals to be tested on, and you'll introduce some dosage of these preservatives, chemicals, or colorings, and you'll scale up the dosage until you see that 50% of the animals have died. And that's very brutal because what it ends up causing, of course, is that you have, like, say, if you had 10 chimps and you've applied the LD50 test on them with some kind of like preservative, food coloring, or additive, you increase the dosage to all of them until half of them have just straight up died from the exposure to that. The other half are going to be sick, vomiting, nauseous, and suffering quite a bit. And again, this is just supposed to give us information about at what level does it start to pose a lethal risk for a mammal with a similar physiological apparatus as a human would have. I read it here, and he says, food additives, including artificial colorings and preservatives, are tested by what's known as the LD50, a test designed to find the lethal dose that will make 50% of a sample of animals die. In the process, all of the animals are made very sick before some finally die and others pull through. These tests are not necessary to prevent human suffering. Even if there were no alternative to the use of animals to test the safety of the products, we already have enough shampoos and food colorings, so there is no need to develop new ones that might be dangerous. Then he talks about the military experiments that are quite rough. It says here, for example, at the U.S. Armed Forces Radiobiology Institute in Bethesda, Maryland, they created an experiment where they would take these rhesus monkeys, a certain species of monkey, and they would train them to run inside of a large wheel. The way that they would do that is that once they were running, if they started to slow down a little bit, they would apply an electrical shock to them. So they would start to like habituate to the idea that they need to always be running fast in this wheel, because if they stop or slow down, they'll receive the painful stimuli of the shock. Now, once we've used this shock method to like train them well to run for long periods of time, we then expose them to like lethal doses of radiation. And we see that how long can they continue to run on the wheel before they collapse, pass out, and die? And why would we do that? It's supposed to give us information about what kind of survival or ratio of survival there could be expected if soldiers were exposed to radiation in the battlefield, like, say, for example, in the wake of a nuclear strike. As the book says, in Bethesda, Maryland, rhesus monkeys were trained to run inside a large wheel. If they slowed down too much, the wheel would slow down too, and the monkeys would get an electric shock. Once the monkeys are trained to run for long periods, they're given lethal doses of radiation, and then while sick and vomiting, forced to continue to run until they drop. This is supposed to provide information on the capacities of soldiers to continue to fight after a nuclear attack. Now, you might argue, well, okay, maybe theoretically that could be of great value to the military. They would know, for example, what kind of capabilities their soldiers would have if they were exposed to those type of conditions. But to be honest, it's a pretty fanciful and far-fetched hypothetical, because we don't generally have chemical and biological weapons used against American soldiers. Or if there were, it would be kind of almost an unprecedented use of munitions against our people. So we're exposing these animals to brutal forms of pain and suffering for the sake of knowledge that's either not strictly necessary or only applicable in highly far-fetched or unlikely scenarios. And, you know, as I'm talking to you about all this, it kind of reminds me about how you may have heard of Elon Musk's Neuralink company, where he's trying to find out ways to implant chips into the brain to restore certain lost function that the brain otherwise would have had if not for, I don't know, epilepsy or brain damage of any number of various kinds. So what he's done in some of these tests are take monkeys, because again, they're primates close physiologically to humans in biological terms. And then in the process of trying to see if these chips will work in their brain, we're doing a lot of pretty brutal and difficult things to those same primates. You know, there's been a lot of them that have suffered greatly in the process of trying to show whether or not the proof of concept installing a chip can somehow take over other cognitive functions that the monkey wouldn't have been able to do without it. So yeah, there's no shortage of examples. I'm just picking on a few, either from his article or others that I've heard about. And at the end of the day, what he's saying is, if you really think that we should give equal consideration to the like interests of animals as to humans, then the animal's interest in avoiding pain, suffering, stress, and all the rest should weigh heavily in our decisions, maybe to not support these type of products that were created through animal exploitation. He says, if you still believe in these experiments, it can't be just because you're saying that animals don't feel pain, but rather because they aren't somehow smart as we are, or they don't have language like we are. But then he challenges the reader. He says, but if that's the case, would you be willing to grant the same kind of treatment to be applied to the mentally disabled, just because maybe they don't have language, reason, or higher thought? That obviously wouldn't qualify them as subjects for these experiments. So he thinks the same reasons that speak against using a human that's mentally disabled in some of these studies should equally speak in favor of not using animals who are cognitively on par with them and capable of suffering just as well as they are. Now, after having given us these views that we can somehow assign speciesism to the use of animals as food or the use of animals in medical experiments, he talks about objections to his argument. So Peter Singer, having read a lot of his work, having taught some of it, you know, he's very detail-oriented in the way that he crafts his argument. So he always tries to consider what his opponent might say in opposition, and then he tries to refute the potential objections, just like a lawyer might do, where they say, you know, I'm gonna anticipate the opposing counsel's argument and try to pre-butt it, if you will, with the jurors by saying, here's what they will argue and here's why those arguments lack merit. So Singer, in the next section of the article, discusses a variety of objections against his view, and he tries to ultimately shut the objections down, show that they don't really defeat his argument. So let's go now into objections to Singer's view. That's the next section of notes. Objections to Singer's view. So one of them is, I think, not the best of all the objections, so we're going to make short work of it. But objection one is, how do we know the animals feel pain? Okay, so can you imagine somebody coming back with this response? You're saying all this stuff about how when we're using animals for meat, when we're using them for experiments, we're exposing them to pain and suffering, and we wouldn't be willing to do that to humans, so that violates equal consideration. But hold on, how do you know they're suffering at all? How do you even know they feel pain? If they're not feeling pain, then there's nothing to give consideration for. But this is probably the weakest of all objections. We definitely know that the animals feel pain, but obviously we are not those animals, so we can't be the animal feeling the pain directly. But what is the evidence that they feel pain? If you could give me your view on that. It's not too, I don't think, complicated. But what reason do we have to come to the conclusion that animals, just like us, can and do feel pain when they're exposed to a painful stimuli? How do we know that? Since you're not the animal, what reasons do we have to think so? There's two main reasons that he gives to respond to this objection. But there's the question, you see it. How do we know that animals feel pain? What would be your reason if someone asked you that question as to what we might say, how we know? What basis is there for thinking they feel pain? Okay, you say the reactions that they have, Mary Jane. Very good. And that's exactly what he says first. He says, well, we can only infer that they have pain based on the behavior that they exhibit. But the behavior of an animal when exposed to a painful stimuli is identical to the behavior of a human when exposed to the same. They cry, they whimper, they yelp, they try to avoid the painful stimuli or escape from it. So they're averse to pain. That's obviously shown by their behavior, which is, again, on par with human behavior in the same case. When a human being is exposed to pain, they instinctively cry out with, and their behavior trying to recoil away from the painful event or source of the stimuli is clear enough. So what he thinks is, obviously, you're never going to be the animal and being able to verify it from the first person perspective. Okay, yep, they feel pain because now I'm the animal feeling the pain. But we can see as they behave in a way consistent with aversive stimuli. The other thing is we don't necessarily even have to just judge it off of behavior, even though the behavior does give a very solid reason to think that they have pain. We also know enough about biology. They have a very similar and common nervous structure, a nervous system structure to us. They have a central nervous system, nerve endings that pass through the whole body and go back to the brain. So physiologically, there's really no distinction between the apparatus that generates pain in a human, the central nervous system and the nerves, and that of the animal. So two main reasons to disqualify this objection straight away. Do we know they feel pain? Yes, because they act in a way that's consistent with that behaviorally, and also from all that we can know in terms of the biology of pain and the systems that generate it, they have the same kind of biological system and apparatus that we have. So let's go on to another objection. There's others that might be a little bit better. The second one is called, he calls it the Ben Franklin objection. I'll tell you why it's called that in just a second. The Ben Franklin objection, so-called. This is one that probably some of you, if you hear me tell you about it, you might be like, that sounds reasonable. I think it's actually a fair point. The Ben Franklin objection includes this basic statement. Animals eat each other, so why can't we? Animals eat each other, so why can't we eat animals too? That's another objection. Let me tell you why it is called Ben Franklin objection. I'm sure you know who Ben Franklin is. It's kind of like one of the old, founding father type figures in early American history. His face is on the $100 bill. So anyway, Ben Franklin, he was a vegetarian for a portion of his life. And one day, according to legend, I mean, some of these stories, are they really just American lore, tall tales? But it's somewhere in the accounts of his life that he was a vegetarian for a while, and on one occasion, he was visiting a friend's house, and the friend was preparing a meal, and the meal had fish. And this friend who's preparing the fish to be cooked opened its stomach and cut it open. And what the friend of Franklin saw when he did that was that inside of this big fish's belly, there was a small fish. So the big fish had another fish inside of it. And according to the story, anyway, Franklin saw that and he was like, you know what? I'm not going to be a vegetarian anymore. Never mind. Because this event, seeing this, observing the small fish inside the big fish, it's made me contemplate something. It's made me reflect on the fact that this fish is just eating another fish. So the fish is eating a fish. Why can't I eat a fish? If I do that, I'm just doing what the fish itself is doing. So if it's not wrong for animals to eat each other, then what's wrong with a human eating an animal? You kind of understand that's the Ben Franklin objection in a brief format. But Singer, again, has a response ready to reply to that. So you ready for this? Here's what he says in response. He says, it's not actually a fair comparison because when animals eat other animals, they're doing so out of literally necessity for survival. The form of life that they have is one that is not compatible with desisting from the consumption of other animals. So when the animal eats another animal, it's because they literally need it for survival. But that's not true of us. You know, as humans, we can and in many cases do survive just fine without consuming meat at all. So how can you say that this is the same kind of situation, an animal that eats another animal, as opposed to one human that eats an animal? The human's not doing so out of a necessity for survival. And then you say down here, I would have thought some would argue cannibalism since the fish are eating each other. Yeah, I mean, definitely when the fish eats another fish, you could think that it's somewhat on par with cannibalism. But again, it kind of, the moral taint of the concept of cannibalism is kind of removed from the animals because they're in nature and they're also not moral agents in the same way that we are, which takes us right into our next point, actually, and I'll say this. He thinks it's odd to say that when animals eat each other, that gives us justification for doing the same, because animals cannot reflect on the moral basis of their decisions. They just do things naturally and instinctively. For example, there's no animal in the world that's sitting at this lecture or a lecture like it or reading books that have this information and is thinking, what are my obligations with respect to other life forms? Should I consider what I'm doing when I interact with them? But we are, you know, blessed, if you will, with higher intelligence. We have language, we have reason, and we have technology as human beings. So he says we bear an additional burden that animals don't have because we can reflect on our moral decisions and the options that we have, whereas they can't do that. Another thing he says, which I found interesting, is that he thinks it's a bit hypocritical or inconsistent for the meat eater to say, these animals, they're not on our level, you know, they're dumb, they don't have language, so therefore there's nothing wrong with eating them. That emphasizes the difference between us and animals. We're smart, they're not. We have language and tool use, they don't have that. But then when it comes time to justify the meat-based diet, someone will say, oh, but we're so similar to them, and that's why it's okay for us to eat them. But now it's kind of getting our wires crossed or being a little bit like inconsistent. Because on the one hand, the advocate of the status quo and the traditional view can say it's why it's okay to eat animals is because we're so different from them, because we're smart and they're not on our par. Now we're switching over to it's okay to eat animals because we're so similar to them. They eat each other and they're just animals eating each other, so we should be seeing ourselves as the same. So he thinks it's odd to encourage us to mimic the beastly behavior of animals when it's convenient to their argument, but to use that as a basis for debunking them from the moral community when it also suits the purposes of the argument. And yeah, so you're saying here, it's basically saying that fish won't hesitate to eat each other, but as humans, we can have that hesitation because we can think about it. Yes. And not just fish, but, you know, other animals too that eat other animals out there in nature. Let me just read you a quote from the guy. And here's what he said about that particular point that we're talking about. Animals eat each other, so why shouldn't we? He says this, the replies can be made in the following way. For a start, most animals who kill for food would not be able to survive if they didn't, whereas we have no need to. Next, it's odd that humans who normally think of the behavior of animals as beastly should, when it suits them, use an argument that implies that we ought to look to animals for moral guidance. The most decisive point, however, is that non-human animals are not capable of considering the alternatives open to them or of reflecting on the ethics of their diet. Therefore, it's impossible to hold the animal responsible for what they do or to judge that because of their killing they deserve to be treated in a similar way. If you're reading this book, though, you have to consider the justifiability of your dietary habits, and you can't avoid responsibility by just imitating beings who are incapable of making these moral choices. So that's his, I guess, assortment of, you know, attempted responses to this new objection. The next thing he talks about are sort of a collection of objections that he groups under the heading of differences between us and animals. So there's obviously some differences between us and animals. Some of these were mentioned at the top of the previous lecture. We can use tools of all kinds of very complicated and sophisticated sorts. Animals can't do that. So does this give us the standing to disregard their interest in avoiding pain? Singer thinks a couple things. First of all, he says, there is at least some, perhaps rare or isolated, but there are some cases of animals using tools in the wild. As he points out here, some say that, so the Galapagos woodpecker uses a cactus thorn to dig insects out of crevices in trees. Some chimpanzees will use branches and such to ferret out termites that they're going to eat. So we at least see some cases of quasi-tool use in the animal world, and the difference is not one of kind, but rather degree. So he sees that as maybe either a non-existent difference between us and them or an arbitrarily selected one. There's also the issue that we have language and they don't have language. We can talk, we can speak, we can read. They can't do that. Does this place us on a tier above them? But he also challenges that, at least in part. He says there's some chimps, gorillas, orangutans that have been taught American Sign Language. You may have heard of Coco the gorilla. I don't know how much we can derive from the example of Coco the gorilla and these others, but it shows that it's not unprecedented for animals to be able to master at least some limited symbolic language usage. And he says, even if we conceded the point and we said, okay, fair enough, they can't use tools, they don't have language, how could that be relevant to the question of whether they can suffer? He returns back to the point that there's, mentally disabled humans that might not have language or the ability to manipulate tools, but we wouldn't disregard their interests in avoiding pain just on that basis. Another difference between humans and animals could be the self-consciousness and the ability to make long-range plans that we have. Like you might be, if you're a college student watching this, you might be planning for your future, for your graduation, for your career, maybe thinking further down the line of starting a family, I don't know, traveling the world, and all kinds of other things. You might say animals, they're living just kind of day to day. They don't have this type of future planning that makes their form of life rich and sophisticated enough to have inclusion in the moral community. But that's also something that could be challenged. There are migratory animals that go far and wide before they return back to a central habitat. They say that the elephant never forgets. So there's some kinds of animals that do exhibit very detailed memories. We're not necessarily going to say they have the same ability to make plans as we do. But, there are bears that hibernate for the winter and squirrels that store nuts for the cold season. You might say that this shows at least some primordial or intuitive sense of having to prepare for future outcomes later on. But even if it didn't, he says, how could that place your desire for the pleasures of meat on par with the animal's desire to be free of pain and suffering? So taken that far, it would imply that humans without the kind of self-consciousness, long-range planning, tool use, or language would also have the same moral status of animals. But of course, we find that wrong. Now, he knows that some people will oppose his argument here by saying that despite the fact that there are mentally disabled humans that may have cognitive abilities on par with animals, that there's still some distinguishing factor which places them inside the moral community, unlike their animal counterparts. And he wants to address those claims as to what the differences might be. So next thing he talks about is what could be a distinction between a mentally disabled human and an animal that has the same level of intelligence. So differences between mentally disabled humans and animals. Why is he making this point? Again, let's try to make sure we follow the plot. He's reached the point in his discussion where he says, we engage in speciesism with regard to the animals. Some people talk about the differences between us and them that justify this unequal treatment. And he says either the differences don't exist, or if they do, they still shouldn't really matter because they can still suffer just like we can, just like a mentally disabled person could suffer even if they were lacking in those capabilities. But now he knows his critic will try and, interject. But aren't there some differences, though, between a mentally disabled human with low intelligence and an animal that has the same? what could the differences be? So here's one attempt to articulate the difference. It will be this claim, that the humans that are mentally disabled, the mentally disabled humans are still members of a species that normally has reason or higher thought, unlike the animals. So we're trying to find out what reason could there be to prioritize the interests of the mentally disabled human over and beyond the animal counterpart that possesses a similar level of cognitive power. And one basis to make that distinction would be to say that, well, if you're a mentally disabled human, you might not have any more intelligence than, say, a cow, pig, or a chicken. But even if so, you're still a member of the human race. You're still genetically a human. And if you're a member of the human race as a whole is still rational. In fact, the word Homo sapiens means, if you go back to the Latin origins, the wise hominid, meaning that the definition itself of what it is to be a human is to have like more intellectual capability than other animals. So if there's a, say, mentally defective or deficient, disabled, I should say, human, who doesn't have the same abilities that other humans have, and they're more similar to animals in terms of their mental powers, you could still argue that unlike the animal they're being compared with, unlike that cow or pig or whatever, they're still a member of the human race, which means that they're a member of a species that has reason. The cow, the pig, they're lacking in cognitive power, but it's normal for them to be that way. Whereas the mentally disabled human is kind of like an abnormal example of a typical human that generally does have those abilities. So you could argue that they get into the moral community on the basis simply that they are the members of a rational type of species. Rather than being rational individuals, they're members of a rational kind. What is he going to say back to that? Well, his response is, here's the reply that he gives. I'll just put it in the chat really quick while I'm talking about it. He says it is wrong to determine how to treat an individual based on what group they are a member of. So normally we think that people should be judged on the basis of their own individuality instead of on the basis of larger groups that they may be a member of. If you had a family that was engaged in a lot of crime or something, and then somebody met you and they're like, you know what, I don't want to associate with you because I know that you're a member of a family that has a record of trouble with the law. You might say back to them, well, come on, don't you need to judge me as an individual? I'm just one person, and it's not really fair for you to look at me on the basis of the group that I'm affiliated with. Or we could take it into even broader context. Suppose that there was some institution which was measuring average scores of men and women in, like, say, math. And I'm not at all giving credence to this, but just say hypothetically that if that institution, the men were receiving average higher scores in their math studies or, evaluations. And then a randomly selected woman came out of that group. Would it be fair for you to say, well, I know you're a woman and you're a part of a group that generally had lower scores, so I'm going to just assume that you're the same? It would be better for you to say, well, I need to know about you as an individual before I make any judgments as to where you rank on the sort of sliding scale of aptitude. So if it's wrong to judge individuals on the basis of what groups they're part of, we think that's wrong in the racial case or in the gender case. I have certain stereotypical assumptions about members of that race, and since you're one of them, I think that you're going to have the same problems that I, probably for mistaken reasons, associate with the whole group. We normally think it's wrong to judge individuals on the basis of group membership, and that it's only reasonable and fair to judge individuals on a case-by-case individual basis. So he thinks that this objection is kind of voicing support that's contrary to that moral principle. Let us judge the mentally disabled human not on their individual capacities, but on the basis of their membership in the larger category of humans overall. And because humans are rational, we should extend the same type of deference to this individual as though they were irrational. It would be wrong if used to justify discrimination against individuals on the basis of the class that they're a part of. And so he thinks the same kind of moral problems adhere to this example too. I'll read you his words. He says, Um, Yeah, he says it's interesting that this suggestion should be made in defense of treating members of our species better than members of another species, when it would be firmly rejected if it were used to justify treating members of our race or sex better than members of another race or sex. When discussing the impact of possible differences in IQ between members of different ethnic groups, I can make the obvious point that whatever the difference between the average scores for different groups, some members of the group with the lower average score will do better than some members of groups with the higher average score, and so we ought to treat people as individuals and not according to the average score for their group, whatever the explanation of that average might be. If we accept this, then we cannot consistently accept the suggestion that when dealing with severely intellectually disabled humans, we should grant them the status or rights normal for their species. For what is the significance of the fact that this time the line is to be drawn around the species rather than around the race or sex? So he thinks this kind of invites forms of discrimination on par with racism and sexism, but applied rather to species once again. So what's a different maybe objection besides this one? Or not objection, but again, another potential difference between mentally disabled humans and animals that could justify their superior treatment to animals, even though they have similar cognitive abilities. Another point to raise a difference, point 2, would be to say or argue that partiality for our own species is necessary and right to maintain our affections for each other. So you might say, okay, is it favoritism that we treat the mentally disabled human with more rights and entitlements than we do animals that we'll just, subject to suffering and pain and then kill and eat on factory farms? You might say, well, the reason that it's okay to have that distinction is because we should feel more favorable, more partial towards members of our own fellow species. We should draw a bright line around members of the human race and embrace all of them as like beings that we should have special care for. And that's necessary and right, because if it wasn't that way, then we might not have the proper affections for one another as humans even. So to maintain the kind of connection that we have with other people, the bonds that we have with other people, we need to insist that we show greater value towards them and their lives than we would with members of other species, for example. Like if we were, for example, to see the mentally disabled human as morally equivalent to the animal, this could somehow cause us to lose favor for fellow human beings. And we need to preserve those feelings of sensitivity towards other humans because it's important to maintain that kind of emotional favoritism, partiality, sensitivity to them. What does he say in reaction to that? Well, he says, in a way, this stated difference depends too much on feelings, which he thinks is an unreliable guide to where your moral duties or obligations lie. Now, of course, we generally care more about, like, say, a mentally disabled human than a cow or a pig. But also, there are many people who have greater friendship and familiarity with their pet than with their neighbor. Certainly, I think I kind of feel like that because I don't really know my neighbors that well at all, even though I've been living here for a few years. But I have very deep, intimate, and close relationships with my cats. Nonetheless, though, some people would take that to such an extreme that if there was like a fire and it was overtaking their house where their pets are inside and their neighbor's house, that they would focus more on getting their pets out of their own house than they would their neighbors, because even though those are their neighbors and they're humans, they love their pets more. He says you'd probably think that that was wrong, to just judge who deserves your assistance on the basis of who you have a standing relationship with. It's more intimate or closely connected. So if it would be wrong for the person to care more about their pet than their neighbor, he thinks it's also wrong on similar grounds to place more value in, say, the mentally disabled human than the counterpart animal, when after all, they're both sensitive beings capable of feeling pain and with similar cognitive capacities. The final reason to draw a major distinction between mentally disabled humans and similar cognitive functioning animals is what he calls the slippery slope. This point will say that if we don't draw favorable treatment towards humans as opposed to animals, like especially in the case of the mentally disabled humans, if we didn't distinguish the two cases and we concede the equal moral status of mentally defective humans and animals, then that would start to put us on a slippery slope towards no longer valuing their lives and using them in medical experiments and, I don't know, other brutal and inhumane forms of treatment. So if we really regarded mentally disabled humans as being on par with animals, so I'm finishing the sentence, 1 second. So the full statement, the slippery slope distinction between the mentally disabled human and animal. This claim basically says that if we did follow Singer's implication and started to think that there's no moral difference between the status of a mentally disabled human and an animal that has, again, similar cognitive limitations, wouldn't that cause us to start not placing enough value in the mentally disabled humans? And then we would start thinking that maybe their rights aren't as strong as ours. And then we might start using them in gross, inhumane, cruel ways on parallel to the way we treat animals. And wouldn't that be horrifying and wrong? So we shouldn't go down that slippery slope. And that's why we should insist on drawing this clear, bright line between all members of the human race, including those with mental limitations, and the non-human animals as contrasted with them. Well, in reaction to this, Singer has, I think, a good and kind of interesting final word. He says that this is actually getting his whole argument wrong, because it's like the slippery slope point is saying that if we see moral equivalence between the non-human animals and the mentally disabled humans, then that will cause us to degrade the treatment of the mentally disabled humans to the levels of current treatment that animals experience. But the whole point of his article and argument is not that seeing similarities between non-human animals and mentally disabled humans should cause us to lower the treatment of the of the mentally disabled humans to the level of non-human animals, but rather to do what? I want to see if anyone here can complete my thought. So on the basis of his position and argument, he doesn't want anyone to think that if we saw equivalence between mentally disabled humans and animals, that should lead us to the implication that we should reduce the current treatment of mentally disabled humans to the level of treatment of animals, but that rather we should what with regard to the treatment of the animals? That's okay, Jasmine, thank you. But let me get an answer if anyone has it here. That we should treat animals better, exactly, Mary Jane, so exactly. Let me put it in the chat since you said it, and then that'll be kind of our last thought. Yes. Sorry, just getting it typed out right. So Singer says the slippery slope point is wrong because it assumes that perceiving a moral equilibrium between a mentally disabled human and animal will mean that we're going to start basically using mentally disabled humans in ways that we use animals, with horrifying and disgusting results. But instead, he says that's getting it wrong, because the whole point of them being seen as on par is not intended to reduce or downgrade the treatment of mentally disabled humans to the current treatment of non-human animals, but instead, on the opposite hand, to upgrade the treatment of non-human animals to the current treatment that we do extend to mentally disabled humans. I'll read you his words then, and that'll be kind of the last thing we'll cover today. she says here at the very end, the slippery slope argument. Yeah, okay. It's important to remember that the aim of my argument is to elevate the status of animals rather than to lower the status of the human. I do not wish to suggest that intellectually disabled humans should be force-fed with food colorings until half of them die, although this would certainly give us a more accurate indication of whether the substance was safe for humans than testing it on rabbits or dogs. I would like our conviction that it would be wrong to treat intellectually disabled humans in this way to be transferred to non-human animals at similar levels of self-consciousness and with similar capacities for suffering. It's excessively pessimistic to refrain from trying to alter our attitudes on the grounds that we might start treating intellectually disabled humans with the same lack of concern we now have for animals, rather than give animals the greater concern that we now have for intellectually disabled humans. So in a way, I guess, you can sort of think, if you want to simplify, maybe oversimplify a bit, Singer's view is that we should think of the non-human animals in the world as deserving treatment that's equivalent to the way we treat mentally disabled humans, because in both cases they lack certain cognitive sophistication, but in both cases they can suffer, feel pain, and therefore we should be equally considerate of their desire to avoid those things as we are in our own case. So, that's an interesting argument. Now, let me just kind of preview for you what's happening next week. When we have this class in a live, in-person format, there's like a viewing of a film that I would usually include in the animal unit of the course, which is called Speciesism. It's an independent film that was made about 10 years ago by, it was at that time, he was a college student named Mark DeVry. I was actually put onto the film by one of the students at Cal State Fullerton, so they suggested that I use it, and I thought that it was actually pretty good for giving a little multimedia perspective on some of the same topics in our book. Obviously, this is an online class, and we can't therefore just put on the video. I mean, I guess I could have put on a Zoom link, and we could have all watched it on the shared screen. But I think that viewing format's a little awkward, and it's not ideal. So what I'm going to do instead is, to Canvas, I'm going to post a link for the video, because you could just watch it online at a certain website. And then that'll be the class meeting thing for the Tuesday meeting of next week. So we won't have a live lecture on Tuesday. It's just going to be for you to view. It's about 75 minutes anyway, so it's about the length of a class period. The Speciesism movie. And not to worry though, as we've always done in this class, we're going to have balance on all the topics. So to everyone wondering, well, where are more robust arguments for the status quo, the anti-animal side of the arguments? We've seen authors like, so far we've just read Singer, and we're going to see the Speciesism movie. Speciesism, the movie, it's a little bit down the middle, but it does lean a little more on the pro-animal side of the debate. So we're going to definitely restore all that balance. In the next few meetings after that, it'll be all these anti-animal authors: Carl Cohen, Immanuel Kant, Roger Scruton, and Marianne Warren. She's coming back again. She's got an article on this topic too, so we're going to touch base with her views on the animal topic. But all these other authors are going to say that there's something that's morally justified with the way that we use animals for food, for medical experiments, and other things. So by the time we're done with the unit, there'll be that same kind of even-handed balance that you see by looking at arguments from both perspectives. I'm also going to place on Canvas next week the next essay prompts, and you'll have over 2 weeks to work on them. It's going to be on the animal topic, the second essay prompt, so just hang in there and you'll get plenty of time to work on it, and we'll, of course, discuss that as well in the next live lecture. So for now, though, if everybody's all good, feel free to sign off and have a great weekend, and I'll be seeing you guys back on Thursday next week. But in the meantime, do reserve some time aside to watch the little movie that I'm going to send around. Okay, thanks everybody so much. Appreciate all of your dedication to the class and your interactions with me here. So it's definitely appreciated. Okay, cool. Thanks so much, everybody. Wishing you a good weekend. And if you need anything in the meantime, you can always email me as usual. All right, then. Have a good one. I'll be seeing you soon. Thanks. Thank you. All right, bye, everybody.